Hello, everyone. This is Philosophy for the People, where me and Ben talk about the weekly essays that Ben puts out in a Substack. And this week, we're going to be talking about his take on MAGA Communism, which comes after he debated Has this week on Wednesday or something.
Wednesday, yeah. I was planning originally on doing a follow-up this week to the essay I wrote last week that I know we haven't talked about yet on Hitchens versus William Lane Craig. And I am going to do that next Sunday, and should also sneak in here somewhere that all of this can be found at benburgess.substack.com. But yeah, I had a very strange debate on Wednesday with this guy, Has, who I always want to say Haas, but I think that's saying the A softer than it's supposed to be, maybe. I'm not sure. In any case, that guy, Infrared. Let's call him that. Who
actually, Infrared is a collective.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah, it's
all right,
like
how's it is. We'll just see if I'm saying that correctly. And so I had that on Wednesday, and I was thinking about, because in preparation for that debate, which I should, without TMI in this, I should also say for various personal reasons, I've been taking some time off from most things, and I had but I had agreed to this before all that happened, and I almost didn't do it. I was like, no, but I don't want to cancel on it after I already agreed to it. And it was a very strange experience for many reasons we could get into. But in the lead up to it, I had read this very long Substack essay that he wrote called "The Rise of MAGA Communism," and there's some stuff that he says in the Substack that I was kind of hoping would come up in the debate, and it never really did. And I was thinking about some of the stuff that did come up in the debate, and I decided that I wanted to shove off Hitchens Craig Part 2 for a week and write about this. And I know, I actually saw somebody in the chat kind of saying, why bother with this, which I actually think is a fair question, right? Usually I would, when I do a debate, I'd be like, yeah, obviously, right? We need to get, socialist ideas out there for people who aren't exposed to them, who are in other media bubbles, etc. I do kind of admit in this essay that it's this a little bit of a strange thing to agree to do, because this is really stretching the outer limits, I think, of the sort of case that I usually make for why this is valuable.
I mean, it got 35,000 views across the 3 channels. I think that's a pretty good argument.
Yeah, so which is right. Yeah, modern day debate, and then GTAA and infrared, I guess. Yeah, okay. So that's that. Yeah, I mean, and so and I think there is something to be said for that. Part of the, so the subject of the debate and the subject of the Substack essay today is Haas's political theory that he calls MAGA communism, which I remember when he and Jackson Hinkle, I suppose, is the Ingalls to his Marx on this one, is that when they first formulated this and it trended on Twitter for a day, I remember talking about it with our mutual friend Jason Miles, and I think my comment at the time was this just kind of seems like political refrigerator magnet poetry to me. You can just sort of shove words together, but what is that?
I mean, I found it interesting in time because I'm in a group chat with one person who's a former Has fan and one person who's a current Has fan, and so I kind of he was going through at the time a rapid period of renaming. Just before, for a couple of weeks, they've been calling themselves mecha tankies. To kind of communicate kind of a futurist, kind of mechanized tanky vision. But that, I mean, it's a bit shit. And so when he came out with MAGA communism, I was like, I think that's good branding. The only problem is the second A. MAG communism, make America great communism. I think that's good branding. But obviously it wasn't some kind of, seemingly it's not at least directly or explicitly some kind of détournement of MAGA. in the sense of kind of exploiting this term, which I think has a lot of power for other ends, but actually seems to be comes along with some kind of actual argument that actually the Republicans are better than the Democrats or whatever.
Yeah, so this is part of my justification for bothering with this at all is that, because, like, look, the average MAGA person, and for, viewers outside of our my uh, strange and increasingly difficult to follow homeland, the "Make America Great Again," which is actually a slogan that Trump himself appropriated from the 1980 Reagan campaign. In the essay, I embed like an old Reagan spot that used it, but but this is like kind of, yeah, this is a branded exercise for Donald Trump and like very, very Trump aligned politicians, people like, if you think about like Marjorie Taylor Greene or Matt Gaetz or people like that, right? The sort of Republicans whose political identity is most Trump based, more or less. And, the average Republican who gets really excited about the MAGA branding, I think, I think if you tell them you're a MAGA communist, they'll, the absolute best case scenario is they'll start walking away from slowly. Like that's because this is sort of, they, I think, correctly understand that to be the polar opposite of what they think, but part of my justification for, kind of age you with this and all, right, is that, okay, the MAGA communism thing is a sort of strange and silly version of maybe something that seems much more widespread to me. And the more widespread thing is this idea that there's some sort of political convergence or realignment that makes like traditional left-right dichotomies sort of outdated because the real thing now is like the establishment, which is like the libs and the never Trumpers, versus this sort of some sort of vaguely populist
versus like 100 congressmen, many billionaires.
yeah, exactly, right. That's the like the populist insurgents like Peter Thiel and and Donald Trump himself and all these congressmen, many of whom are themselves at least millionaires, and all of the people who are like actually like I mean, really, if you not to be too ad homish about this, if you like outside and talk to some people, the people you'll find who are like the most into the MAGA branded, who are like small business owners who are often like the sort of real kind of core of this on a grassroots level. Then it's like those people, right, who are like the real insurgents, and like and you'll find a lot of people who will say, a lot of people who are much more mainstream than Haas, who will say that it's like, well, because really these these plucky insurgents, like Peter Thiel, are they're populists about they don't like corporate America and big pharma, and they're anti-war, right? That's part of it. They're anti-war, and so part of the case that I wanted to make, and I thought it would be, again, part of my excuse for doing this in the first place is like, I thought it'd be interesting to have this argument with somebody who, theoretically is some kind of Marxist. So there's like shared premises I wouldn't normally have in this argument. That, this sort of core case I wanted to make is like, all of that is just absolute nonsense, right? There's no, the flag of Trumpism, right? Which is what MAGA stands for, is, like try to associate that flag with any sort of like pro-worker or anti-imperial policy, is just nonsense on stilts, right? If you actually look into like the stuff that Donald Trump did, then he was a giant hawk, right? I mean, he wore it all. I mean, withdrew from the Iran deal, assassinated Soleimani, moved the U.S. embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. He had
And the story where he killed Soleimani was so funny because obviously, like he orders the death of Soleimani, and then basically Iran gets like implicit permission to then bomb a U.S. military base in response, and then Trump asks the Iranians if he can like bomb like an empty beach of theirs in Iran to like tit for tat back, and they're just like no.
Well, he was said like because originally didn't he say he was gonna like bomb like dozens of he was gonna like intentionally bomb like holy sites in Iran, and presumably somebody was like, yeah, maybe don't do that, right? That's probably gonna go in a place
right, and then obviously libs were like, he's admitting to doing war crimes on Twitter. We're going to arrest him right now. It's going to happen. It's like, oh yeah, yes.
Yeah, sure, right. I mean, I always thought like there's something really funny about like all the people who like sort of watch MSNBC all day who are always like, why hasn't Trump been arrested yet for this or that or the other thing? It's like, well, so this is like the only person with a significant amount of political power in American history who you think is going to face some sort of legal consequence for something, right? I mean, like this. I mean, I guess it didn't happen in 1,000 of the 1,000 previous cases, but now's the one, right? This is the time, right?
It happened to anti-establishment and nearly nuclear war causer Richard Nixon.
Yes. So this is one of the funny things about this. So in the debate itself, I talked about Donald Trump's actual record as I think actually kind of a crazy warmonger in foreign policy, and as somebody whose domestic economic policies were
someone who killed a lot of communists.
Yeah,
in Vietnam.
So anyway, so like I talked about Trump's record, and Haas said, well, okay, but like MAGA is counter-hegemonic, and which part of what he explained, what he meant about that, is that they hear all these establishment forces that MAGA people see as their enemies, and like one of them was the media. And I was like, well, hold on, if the liberal, like if just like ranting about the liberal media is enough to make counter-hegemonic, right? Then like Nixon was forget Trump. Nixon was counter-hegemonic.
But Ben, you didn't know the law, and he was like, yes, of course.
Yes. So this is the thing, and then he was like, yes. You're taking this as a like reductio ad absurdum, but no, Nixon was counter-hegemonic. That's why the CIA did Watergate, and which is the point where since I'm only human, I started to laugh, and and he got mad. So this is new to me, and you have an advantage over me here because I have to say, like my previous Haas experience before this debate was I had watched one of his previous debates. It was the one with him and Hinkle debating Destiny and Dylan Burns about the war in Ukraine, and he absolutely loses his shit in that debate, like to a point where when he said he wanted to do this one with me, there was all this negotiation in advance about the format and stuff that he kind of made a couple references to, which was all basically me being like, I don't want to sit through if this is what this is going to be like, right? Like I saw one version of what this could be like. If this is going to be like that, I'm out, right? Conversation's over if it starts to be like this. He kind of made a couple references to that. If you watch the debate I did Wednesday, but so I'd watched that one where he's like sort of he's defending the justice of invading Ukraine as denazification and whatever else, right? Which it is also, by the way, just footnote to this, like I think one of the crazier things about this debate that I did with him was in the Q&A, somebody asked basically for him to list off some of his favorite, where each of us list off some of our favorite world leaders, and one of his was Putin, which I think is like pretty amazing for anybody who calls himself a communist, because I mean this guy is like Vladimir Putin was literally the handpicked successor to Boris Yeltsin I mean, he is the direct heir of the people who destroyed the Soviet Union and raped the corpse and stripped it for valuables. But in any case, so he's in that debate. He's both defending Putin and Putin's war in Ukraine, and then he's also just screaming insults a lot, right? So that's like it. I saw that. I read this Substack post on MAGA Communism, and I was actually at a conference once in person that he was at, and I watched like a couple bits in person of a panel he was on, and honestly, it was kind of too painful to watch
I
because
didn't realize he like went out and did panels.
yeah, it was honestly, I mean, I know what this sounds like coming from me, but like I'm being completely like literal about this. I felt embarrassed for him because he was arguing. That was also with Destiny, and he was arguing about like it was like the subject of the panel was like, is the Biden administration a success so far, or something like that, and like it was like a real dumb thing anyway. But they have and he was arguing what would have been my side of that, right? Had I been on it, right, which is the Biden sucks side. And in the course of it, like I remember him saying something like, "Well, it's the economy, whatever." And Destiny, I think, was like, "Well, okay, but like, what do you think you should do about the economy specifically?" And he was like, "I should get with the economics people and figure out a plan or something like that." It's like, oh, you literally have no idea what you wanted to do. And I started to just like, I think it was very cringy and embarrassing. And like, I actually had to get up and leave it. So it's like, these are my dating points, more or less. About how
did you talk
also
about
I heard
socialism in the debate?
about him like challenging him to a fight, and then he didn't want to. But like, so that's what I know about this guy. But you actually know some stuff about him. So like, you already knew that he thought that Richard Nixon, to the surprise of many millions of surviving family members of dead communists in Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia, was an enemy of like American imperialism or something.
You put these up as kind of like the dankest has takes, but these are all pretty kind of like surface level ones. Especially kind of, I mean, 5 is like an essential kind of basic point. But the real has takes are like, well, the big one is that we're already living in socialism and have been since like the early 20th century. That basically the bourgeoisie ended the like anarchy of production at the start of the 20th century. And since then, kind of, we've lived in like through the state or whatever, like production's been socialized, but it's being controlled by like a small elite at the top, and so on. So there isn't kind of capitalism in the sense of an anarchy of production, of actual strong competition based around profit and that kind of thing. But there's other stuff, like dinosaurs aren't real. Genes, genetics. Well, the dinosaurs aren't real thing is like, it's kind of like an almost ironic take that basically like we shouldn't talk about things which we don't have kind of like empirical historical access to, and that dinosaurs happened so long ago, it's kind of just like live bullshit that they want you to talk about. But that links into a more major theory of his, which is believing in anabiotic oil theory.
I don't know what this is.
There was kind of like a theory which some oil companies got scientists to make up in the 1960s, which basically argues that oil is produced by bacteria who live deep down in the crust, so that we have infinite oil basically, and we shouldn't worry about anything like that. And that links to basically the idea of this is because this is argued for the sake of believing that Earth is like a cornucopia, that we can continually maximize production. And there's obviously at this level, you're like, how much is this actually believed and how much is it rhetorical? But yeah, on the genetics things, they support the Soviet crop scientist, this Lysenko, like the
Lysenko, yeah, sure.
Yeah, the Lamarckist guy.
right, interesting.
Hinkle, Hinkle to him too. So yeah, that's like the real deep stuff. Um, but I
Yeah,
think
so I was just surprised by yeah. So what was on that list? That was okay. So Nixon was counter hegemonic, so the CIA did Watergate. I guess I'm not totally clear on whether the CIA faked the break-in or they just like saw to it that it brought down Nixon. But
someone in someone called TankyBot said in the chat, "These are all memes, lol. Apart from the jeans one, that's real."
yeah, um, the yeah seemed to be serious about the Nixon thing, which is amazing because again, like if you know, especially from I mean, you know, especially from that kind of look, you want to be a tanky, you know, you want to defend, you know, actually existing socialist regimes. It's like Richard Nixon, you know, has killed millions of people in an attempt to crush the formation of actually existing socialist regime in Vietnam.
I mean,
But
the real hot take is that Nixon was a Maoist, and so he's bad because he's a Maoist.
yeah, because he sided with Mao against the Soviet Union. Yeah, no, that would be the top tier hot take.
But
Although
do
it's
you want
actually
to?
not too
Do you
far
want to?
something that Haas said, which was that Trump is chaotic and he's a Maoist, and Mao said chaos is good, so he likes Trump.
I think it's a better argument than actually kind of anything which actually favors
Ugh.
Trump. But do you want to talk about which I think is an interesting thing, which is at least mostly wrong about, but I think it's worth kind of talking about, and is I don't know, maybe his take is actually less wrong than what a lot of other leftists have, which is kind of around this thing of service workers.
Yeah. So this is something that came up in the debate. So basically, you know, like the first chunk of the essay is just kind of me going through the kind of basic core of the issue about like, okay, is there really this kind of realignment? You know, does this make any sense at all? Is MAGA just, you know, what I think it is, which is just a very shallow rhetorical exercise in rebranding very standard Republican politics? So that's, you know, that's like kind of the first chunk because that was like the sort of main case I was making in the debate itself, and then I sort of go into a couple of, you know, if that was all it was, I wouldn't have put this on the philosophy Substack. Then, you know, like the main kind of part of the essay is going into two more sort of interesting theoretical questions that come up around all this. One is, you know, I guess we can do after is something he said on his original Rise of MAGA Communism Substack. And then the one before that is that you just asked about is his take on service workers. And both of these, I think, are pretty badly misconstruing arguments that Marx makes in Capital. So on service workers, you know, the way all this comes up in the first place is that you know, in sort of talking about how bad and reactionary Trump and MAGA Republicans are, I talked about the way that Trump's NLRB, National Labor Relations Board, which I think tellingly Haas didn't seem to be in his vocabulary. I think he said the acronym wrong a couple times in the debate, which I only bring up. I know it's petty just because it's like, I think it shows it's really just not the kind of issue, right, that he think about in the normal course of things. But you know, Trump's NLRB, you know, made a series, like was full of like hardcore union busters and made like a series of incredibly hostile decisions that, you know, made it much harder to organize unions. And like as bad as Biden is, and as bad as like the imposing the deal on the rail workers is and all that stuff, it's, you know, it would have been much harder for, like, you know, the example I gave is this recent massive wave of like hundreds of Starbucks being, or, you know, organized to happen under Trump's NLRB. And Haas's response to that, he said a few things in response to it, but the most sort of, you know, and some of them were just kind of boilerplate, frankly, internet-y right-wing things. But the most interesting thing that he said is what you're talking about, I think, which is he said, well, I don't really care essentially about Starbucks workers organizing, and he even extended this by the end of the conversation to like any, seems like McDonald's workers, whatever, right? He doesn't want any of them organizing unions. At the very least, he doesn't care about it. Sometimes he said he didn't care. Sometimes he seemed to be going further than that and saying it was actually actively a bad thing for various reasons. But because the essential point is that he thinks that service workers aren't really part of the working class, or if they are, they're not like the sort of important or politically supportable part of the working class or something like that, right? And all of this is based on his reading of a couple of things that Marx says in Capital. And I guess I want to sort of, just to be scrupulously fair about this, I mean, say like, okay, here's the stuff he's putting together that's not totally wrong, right? So so when Marx talks about the labor process in Capital, he talks a lot about sort of taking what we get from nature and transforming it into human use values. So, not that like, whatever, you just think about like, miners mine something that, then gets processed into something that blah, 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 right? 20 steps later, right, becomes a car. That's like an example of that. And this is, Marx is like very interested in this, not just for his analysis of Capital, but also just his sort of general analysis of how production works in any society. And it has a lot to do with his sort of overall theory of the stages of history and how different modes of production rise and fall over the course of economic and hence political history. And so related to this, Marx does make a distinction in some places. And it's, to be fair, I think it's not always totally clear in Marx how the distinction is being drawn, right? Like, because there are sort of scattered things you have to look at and try to put together about productive versus non-productive labor. So in other words, there's labor that would have to happen regardless of how society was organized in order to convert what we get in nature into human use values. And then there's labor that's like not necessary in that sense, right? It's like just sort of an artifact of the way that society is organized under capitalism, for example, but like in a different kind of society, it wouldn't exist. So it's like a sort of, if you're, it's, I don't know, like a sort of, I remember G.A. Cohen and Karl Marx's Theory of History has a nice example about this, about like if you have like some slaves on a farm, if there's the like actual agricultural tools the slaves are using are productive, but like the wall that they build to stop the slaves from escaping, right, isn't, because it's something that's only necessary because of a specific way that this mode of production works. Not something that would be necessary for production to happen at all, at least given that level of development of technology, blah, blah, blah. Okay, all of which is to say, if you think about those elements I just laid out, you can kind of see how Haas gets where he gets, because he says, well, okay, manufacturing work is one thing, if you're making things, but if you're, and presumably he'd also throw in like extraction, like the example about the miners and etc. But if you're just doing service work, well, that's not, then you're not making things, therefore you're not a productive worker, which he seems to kind of equate with like not being part of the working class, or at least not being part of, I don't know, the part of the working class that could potentially be engaged in struggle at the workplace that has like, that's going to matter for socialist strategy or something like that. And what I would say is that to give him also, to completely give him his due, I think Marx a little bit, maybe not 100% consistent or clear, certainly if you compare some of the things he says in Volume 1 of Capital, which is the only one that Marx actually finished and polished and all that stuff in his lifetime, with like some of the unpublished notebooks that got is 2 and 3 and Gundrisa, and things that he wrote elsewhere, things he said in letters, whatever. If you sort of start to put all this together, it's not totally clear that everything that Marx says about this fits together. He mentioned a comment about clerks in Capital Volume 2, although I think there's also a place where Marx very explicitly says that like teachers are productive workers, which is,
it's one of my favorite passages of Capital, because in those a few lines, he gets across both the point that to be a worker, you don't have to directly produce a commodity, and he very clearly goes against any valorization of the working class. It's where he says that being a worker is a curse.
Yeah, well, that's the other thing too that I think Haas is getting wrong. So, let me just real quick run through like
because to be clear, the thing I do agree with Haas on is that Starbucks, service workers, etc., are not important workers.
Depends what you mean by important. I think that they we'll definitely get to that, but I mean just to sort of like real quickly rehearse what I think is what I think he's getting wrong about Marx's argument in Capital. I think that basically two things. One, I think that Marx doesn't restrict the working class in the sense that matters for the class struggle to just productive workers. I think he very clearly doesn't do that. And in fact, I think if you sort of understand the main things that Marx is saying, they wouldn't make sense if he was doing that. And then two, also, what baristas do at Starbucks is very, very clearly and ambiguously productive work, as Marx uses that phrase.
Right, they make things.
Yeah, they make things, right? Like this is like if you are grinding up coffee beans and straining hot water through them and foaming milk and all that stuff, then what are you doing? You are transforming materials derived from nature in order to meet human use values.
And do you know who doesn't make things? Truckers.
Yeah, that's very true, right? And now I actually think if you look at some of Marx's comments about this, I think Marx uses the term production so capaciously. Truckers might even count, but like they have
right. Like obviously, in the end, truckers and railwaymen and whatever obviously do contribute to the general profit making in capitalism, right?
Yeah, exactly. So it's like
and I think that the strenuous labor, right? They're necessary.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, Marx says has this really interesting comment in Capital about how the fish in the ocean are part of the fisherman's means of production. And all the fisherman is producing in any immediate sense is like he's transforming fish in water to fish on land. That then later, further transformations, gut them and grill them and whatever, or
I mean, now people are reacting kind of in chat as if I've now said because of that truckers aren't completely important workers. But no, my point is exactly to take out these things that baristas directly produce commodities, but I don't think they're important and a vital part of a revolutionary class. But truckers don't directly produce commodities, but I think are an essential part of any revolutionary class.
Yeah, so I think I might know what you mean, but just to be really clear, do you want to kind of lay out what you mean?
Well, basically, service workers, if they stopped working in a capitalist society,
right? Yep.
At least most of them, 90% of service workers went on strike. 90% of everything would be fine. If truckers and railwaymen and workers permanently went on strike, they would all collapse, including the service industries.
Right, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I think there's a sense in which that's right. I think that I think some sectors are more strategically important than others because of the size, right? Like the number of workers involved, because of the sort of centrality to the kind of what you can actually and it's funny here too, you can make distinctions that are very much within what you would typically think of as kind of core worker jobs, because it's honestly, if you're in if you're in the say, I don't know. They have a it's what's if you're producing Raisin Bran, right? You're at the Raisin Bran factory in Battle Creek in Michigan, and you go on strike. Well, eventually that'll mean there's a shortage of Raisin Bran at the store, and that's
Right, and the other point I was going to make that this
going to
actually
cause a certain shortage. But I was just going to say, like, who has a hell of a lot more strategic power than workers in the Raisin Bran manufacturing factory is like longshoremen, right? Like that like you could like actually stop global trade from going on. I mean, like that has like massively more disruptive effect. Or like rail workers, right? I mean, that's why Biden stopped them from going on strike. That they have a rail strike would have had immediately disruptive effects in ways that even lots of core manufacturing work wouldn't necessarily, right, depending on specifics.
It's absolutely essential for kind of MAGA communists and all kind of conservative socialists for whatever reason. They feel a complete need to valorize factory workers completely. But of course, it's not just like the thing with factory workers is a massive percentage of them are now committed in their labor to making absolute fucking tat. So much of the work which currently goes on in factories all across the world, in China and elsewhere, is not essential labor.
Well, it's
the production of Garfield cats.
Yeah. Well, this is exactly the point that I made in the article, that it's like that there's this sort of confusion I think that he's got going on between this sort of productive, non-productive category from capital and then these two other issues, which are you've both alluded to, right? Which are one, like whether in a different sort of society would continue to have a certain sort of labor, and then also whether it's like sort of innately dignified or fulfilling or something like that. Right? And I think both of those are all three of those are totally separate issues, and none of them really have anything to do with why it's important to have an organized working class, very much important, including the kind of work that the vast majority of American workers do, right? Which would sort of be clumped under this not very clear or precise category of service work, which includes lots of making stuff. So really, quickly on that, I think, like the thing that I am emphasizing there is, like there's this distinction that sort of sounds very nitpicky and pedantic, right? That you'll sometimes run into if you see people arguing about this stuff, about labor and labor power. And I think it is actually an important one, that they have labor, right, is the stuff you're doing, right? Labor power is capacity to do stuff. And in capital, Marx's analysis is that the thing that workers are selling in capitalist labor markets, right, the thing they're selling to employers is their labor power, right? In other words, what they're sort of a way of saying that is what they're selling is their time, right? And they're and in fact, if you read Capital, you really read it, the Marx's analysis of exploitation, which there's certainly a form of that he's talking about in terms of extracting surplus value. There are places where he does seem to be talking about extracting literal money, right, which is of course different than value, et cetera. But but Marx's overwhelming emphasis in that book is really about the extraction of surplus time. You'd have to, people would have to. There's there's the nature imposed necessity that's a certain amount of life, turning what you get from nature into human use values, so you can have the use values at the end. But then there's a social system imposed necessity to spend these extra hours working to enrich, depending on what kind of system we're talking about, slave owners or feudal lords or modern capitalists. And that's really what Marx is laser focused on, which I think is important for two reasons. One is that even if Starbucks workers were not active in Marx's sense, which they absolutely are not, they in fact, the number of links in the chain separating the immediate differences of nature from the materials being transformed behind the counter at Starbucks is actually way less than the number of links in the chain involved in the materials you're transforming if you're like on an assembly line at an auto plant. But even if they were not, mostly doing non-productive tasks, that's not really the point, right? I mean, the point is that the working class is the segment of the population whose, economic circumstances give them no realistic option except for to sell their labor time to a capitalist. That's the essential thing that they have.
The proletariat is the class which owns nothing and does everything.
Yeah, exactly, right? And it's like whether the specific task that that your capitalist has directed you to do during any particular working hour is productive or non-productive is sort of beside the point, right? I mean, it's like whether it's like, you spend the whole time working behind the cash register at Starbucks, which would be non-productive, or you spend the whole time, grinding coffee beans and brewing espresso, which is productive.
I mean, from reading chat, I've got maybe the impression that I'm wrong, and that if service workers went on strike in the US, no one would learn how to make a coffee at home, and all Americans would.
Yeah, I mean, look, I hope this is tested soon. But in case, I've got, and it's also very importantly, and I really like your point about that passage about the teachers. It's also very importantly just totally alien to the spirit of what Marx is doing in Capital to say, oh, the productive work is like good, dignified work, right? That's great. You shouldn't want to work at, Starbucks because that's like bad and undignified, but like working in a factory is great, which by the way, I just want to say parenthetically, look, I don't,
It ruins your body and your mind. Well, I mean,
yeah, I mean, like I've known people pretty well who have worked at factories, and zero of them have had that take on it, right? Like that's like, oh yeah, I really wish I could have spent a couple more decades, in that factory, right? Like, yeah, it ruins your body, it ruins your mind. You're doing mind-numbing, repetitive tasks all day, every day, often in in noisy, conditions, and often dangerous conditions, et cetera, et cetera. And and Marx says, I mean, like there's this face, in the notebooks that got Ingalls edited into Volume 3. There's this famous passage where Marx is like, to it's the thing about the realm of necessity and the realm of freedom, where he's to paraphrase lightly, right? I mean, he says, look, it's really important that we like, yes, absolutely, let's achieve the society of associated producers where there's workers controlled means of production, but like just because you're working in a worker controlled factory doesn't mean you suddenly love working in a factory, right? The realm of freedom is like you're entering into to the extent that you can minimize, right, the number of hours a day that you have to spend just grinding to meet your daily needs. I mean, this is the ultimate sort of dream and about advanced stage communism and critique of the Gotha program, is that you can have, a society where, automation under conditions of collective ownership and various cultural changes he thinks are going to happen and all this stuff combined to produce this effect where you don't have to link people's subsistence to work anymore, that people will just sort of, do what interests them. And, maybe like, maybe so much is automated that like, if like, look, some people's interests take them to spend their time writing poetry, and some people's interests, they, do this or that or the other thing. Some people's interests drive them to become, computer engineers, and they're like enough of those people, that that stuff gets made and everybody can just kind of take what they need, right? This is, we can argue about the level of like realism or, how much of that is going to come to pass or whatever, although I think it's a useful regulative ideal regardless. But it's like, but like this is what makes Marx tick. I mean, there's like going all the way back to like the economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844. There's this this wonderful passage in there where he's talking about how he's like deploring the fact that in capitalist society, it's like people are encouraged to to like spend their entire lives on their economic lives. So I'd work to meet their needs, and he talks about like how this takes away from everything that makes us human, and it's like a very it's a very like bohemian 1840s student revolutionary kind of list of things that he rattles off. I mean, it's culturally specific, but like it's like going to the theater and fencing and stuff like that. But it's like, yeah, that's what he. I mean, Marx is not sitting around thinking it's like, man, wouldn't it be amazing if we had a society where everybody could be like a Stocknevite in a collectivized steel mill, and and that would be just like work constantly at the steel mill, right? I mean, that's kind of the opposite of the point,
right? I mean, the value of the factory worker such that it exists is kind of being concentrated together, and seeing the sharp end of productive labor so that they can abolish this labor.
right? Exactly. Yeah.
But
Yeah. No. Exactly.
I think another important point, which I think gets disappeared by basically everyone in this sort of conversation, is that the proletariat being revolutionary isn't a premise of the argument, right? It's a conclusion.
Right.
Like, this is a conclusion that Marx comes to in analyzing the conditions of the proletariat at that time in history. It can be the fact that you can be proletarian and non-revolutionary, because it's a conclusion, not a premise, right?
Sure. Yeah.
And so I think that's kind of that lots of people run into both things, where they'll say Starbucks workers aren't revolutionary, therefore they aren't workers. Or they'll conversely say, well, Starbucks workers are obviously fucking workers, they make things, thus they're necessarily revolutionary. But neither conclusion could be true, but neither of them are necessarily true. Like, it's not embedded in having your surplus labor extracted from you, or whatever, or being dispossessed, or being the class which labors, something, or blah, blah, blah. There's something in there that inherently makes you revolutionary.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that seems right. I mean, I think that the revolutionary potential of the working class is about having, a set of class interests that points in that direction, and having the collective capacity to act on those interests, right? In other words, like that the working class is positioned such that it can change society. It has a power to that other groups, which are, working class is not even the most, if we're just talking about like oppression, just degrees of mistreatment, right? The working class is not actually the most mistreated part of capitalist society. I mean, like this is there are lots of people who are in a position below that who would fucking love to be in the working class, right? That would be that,
right? And then various stupid leftists who spent like the last 100 years or so valorizing the lumpens because
exactly. It's like you're missing the point, because it's not like you get morality points for being oppressed. It's that they have it's that the working class, what makes it distinctive, it's an oppressed class that has this structural power to change society, and has an interest in changing society in a certain direction, and et cetera. That's the key point, right? I mean, because it's like,
and it's normally kind of a relatively privileged sector of the working class, which is the most revolutionary, which makes complete sense, right?
Sure.
It's the people who have, the money to go on strike. It's the people that have sufficient labor conditions that they can engage in union politics, that they can read these literature and so on. If you're being constantly absolutely smashed totally to bits in the labor process, then it's really hard to be revolutionary.
Totally. It's also, I also think there's something to be said for like, just that it's like, this is kind of it's kind of the same thing that's like wrong with like accelerationism. Like, if we get the most reactionary faction of the capitalist class in power, then like people are going to suffer so much that they'll be so mad, right, that they'll make a revolution, which like never actually seems to happen that way. That it's like, well, no, I think there's something to be said for like, if people are just like constantly experiencing defeats, they don't usually draw like revolutionary conclusions from that, right? They have if anything, like if you're just constantly, having your skull cracked, then like, a little bit of relief from that will be taken as enough of a win, and like, you're not going to want to jeopardize the, little relief, and you'll have or like you'll just want to keep your head down and try to make a better deal for yourself and your family or whatever, right? Whereas like I think oftentimes
every minor reform that the working class wins in capitalism furthers, I mean, makes worse or whatever the profitability crisis.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think that there's like people who have actually won things are more likely to believe that they can win more things in the future. People who've won things can have might actually be more willing to go to bat to preserve those things, and to feel some kind of confidence. And I mean, like this is in fact, oftentimes revolutions happen even in despotic regimes, like after there's been a certain amount of liberalization. Like there's just this idea that it's like sort of the more oppressed you are, the more revolutionary your consciousness will be. I think is a very poor fit with most of the, the historical evidence. So yeah, I mean, I think that so all of this has been about sort of what the working class is and why it's important. But then there's this other issue that came up in the debate with Haas, or it didn't come up in the debate with Haas. It came up in his Substack, but he never quite got to it in the debate, which is actually, to my mind, even more important and sort of cuts more to the core of like what's wrong with this sort of attempt to combine these things. It's like, here's this wonderful MAGA populist revolt against the lib elites.
I mean,
So
they did produce the funniest day in history, which is January 6th, of course.
Oh, sure.
So fucking funny.
Yeah, that's yeah. Fair. So yeah, it's like, okay, so obviously there's all this revolutionary potential from like the Q shaman and all those people, right? So let's combine it with communism. The people, like, one thing I think that's I think the thing that's like even more deeply wrong with that is related, right? But it's like different, which is that it's sort of, in order to make that work, even to the extent that Haas makes it work in the Substack post, I think you have to have a kind of vision of the socialist project that sort of weirdly takes out the class struggle part, because, which kind of makes sense, right? Because if you're going to sort of valorize all of these, reactionary nationalist projects, right, that like it kind of makes sense that you just want to talk about the people. And in certain contexts, he's making class distinctions, but in certain contexts, he sort of like really seems to be working very hard to obscure class distinctions. And he even says things I think I find really interesting about how and this sounds sort of very Marxy up until you get to the conclusion, about how, look, capitalist, private property isn't about you getting to keep your stuff. It's about the banks and BlackRock and everybody taking away your stuff. It's like I could, in a certain way, nod along with all of that, right? But then, like, he seems to then suggest that actually, the MAGA communist platform is to let you keep your stuff. And sure, maybe private property, the means of production, will go away one day, but that's going to be like history or the forces of production that are sort of doing that. And like, we're not trying to take anything away from you. And when it would be taken away, it would be under conditions where there wouldn't even be any opposition to it or something like that. And all of which just seems bonkers to me because, and I think really misses again, there's part of that that's like very much like what Marx does say at Capital, but there's part of it that like could not be less like it, right? So the part of it that's Marx certainly thinks the development of the forces of production over the course of history is what is, in a certain sense, what drives changes in the mode of production. But that's because when you get a conflict between the further development of the forces of production and the existing mode of production, that tends to be in Marx's analysis when you get successful revolutions, but you still need to do the revolution part. And in the and and it is true, like in Capital, like this is actually the class that I've been teaching at Capital. We do we're just doing this part now. The final part of the book. He talks about, well, so-called primitive accumulation. It's not his phrase, but whatever. He's talking about this massive process by which capitalism was sort of born through the theft of things belonging to petty proprietors, and it's sort of the most like gruesomely gripping part of the book. I have I kind of throw a joke into the essay about how if Marx were trying to get like Verso or Sublation or somebody to publish Capital now, they'd probably make him move that to the beginning of the book, to readers. But in any case,
Nick Land summarizes it in a few words where he talks about the blood and shit stains of primitive accumulation.
Yeah, that is very well put. So Marx does say all that, right? He does talk about this massive process of theft, without a farthing of compensation, that all of basically the immediate producers being separated by like real like violence and bloodshed from their traditional means of production, which was the land, so that feudal lords who were converting themselves into modern capitalists could more efficiently exploit that land, so that those workers would then become a labor force that was desperate enough to take jobs in the truly nightmarish conditions of early industrial revolution factories. Marx says all that. He talks about that extensively. That's all true, but like the way that Haas presents all this in the Substack essay really seems to miss Marx's big conclusion, which is like where the whole primitive accumulation section ends up, right at the end of chapter 32, which is, I have mixed feelings about some of the ways in which people sometimes use the word, but I think dialectical feels like the right way to put it here, right? Which is like that it's like, yes, there is this like terrible crime that's been committed in the past, but the point is not that we're going to just reverse it and go back to the way that things were.
Right. And that's very interesting, I think, because Haas says, and I don't have any reason to do not believe him, is that apart from Dugin and Marx, one of his biggest influences is Nick Land. And I feel like within, like talking about why he opposes the Democrats and the establishment and lots of even unions is to do with kind of Nick Land's concept of the cathedral, that these kind of forces are kind of slowing down, inhibiting capitalism, and preventing us from getting to socialism. But then to support the petty bourgeoisie to do exactly that, to slow down capitalism and blah, 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 and stop the process of accumulation is completely bizarre. And that's kind of what I find so interesting about kind of MAGA communism, patriotic socialism, whatever, is that it's kind of an inversion. It's the opposite side. It's the opposite face of kind of the leftist tendency, several different leftist tendencies. One towards the valorization of the least revolutionary class, the lumpen, is met with the valorization of the other least revolutionary class, the petty bourgeoisie. Kind of the section of the left which valorizes the Democrats is met with a valorization of the Republicans. And so kind of a lot of the sick tendencies of the left are then reflected with kind of in their opposite exact manner in this kind of movement.
Yeah. I mean, I think that like, I'm just trying to make sure I got all that. I mean, I think that, it's like a really important point that it's like what Marx is ultimately saying is that, you don't, I mean, and it's funny, like, cause like there's in this part, right? I mean, lest anybody think that I'm caricaturing this, I linked to his Substack a few times in the course of it. It's 13,000 words, so I don't blame you if you don't read the whole thing. But if you sort of,
I misread it and thought you said 1,300, and I was like, oh, that was short. But no,
that's not too bad at all. Yeah, that's like on the
Jackman
articles. Yeah, so it's very long, but if you like sort of go down to the, you just do like a search in it for expropriate, right? You find the right paragraphs from the essay, and and he's like really going out of his way to say, no, we're not advocating, the expropriation of anything. Like, sure, maybe private property means of production will go away in the future when history is ready to deliver that or something like that, right? But it's like he says, but since socialist, MAGA communists, we want more wealth, more prosperity. That like this compatible with, he says, pro-people policies like cutting red tape and cutting taxes, which is also pretty funny while we're talking about capital. That like a big thing going on in capital is Marx's celebration of the great historic victory of the introduction of red tape to the labor process, right? I mean, like chapter 10 about the working day. I mean, like at the end, he calls the 10 hours bill the Magna Carta of the working class. That this, I mean, like he's celebrating the birth of the regulatory state, and it's like, no, the point, it's like, yeah, you don't want to slow down. I mean, not for, I mean, yeah, I don't know if it's exactly the same as the Nick Land point, but like Marx's point certainly is like, no, it's not like, in fact, he says in the footnote at the end of that section, at the end of chapter 32, like he's got a quote from what he and Engels say in the Communist Manifesto. Or, let's be real about this, what he said in the Communist Manifesto. I think Engels kind of supported him and bought him brandy and cigars while he was writing it, and put his name on it. But in the where he says that look, there's other classes, these artisans, small shopkeepers, and all these people, right? They fight the bourgeoisie, but then they're not revolutionary class because they're not fighting it to try to move history forward, right? They're fighting it to try to turn the clock back, right? To when they have more, right? And like what he says at the end of chapter 32 is that you have like this gruesome and awful and criminal process of expropriation that he's documented over the centuries in England and Scotland in those chapters is, that having been completed, that lays the groundwork for this much more positive kind of expropriation where that he does say, could be much less violent and much shorter, because instead of a minority of society trying to expropriate the holdings of the great mass, it's the other way around. It's the great mass of society expropriating, the holdings of, small minority. And so that's like easier to do, right? It's a very hopeful, revolutionary thing, but it's not like, history with capital H or something about the abstract development of the forces of production or something is sort of giving you this outcome. It's still class struggle is still delivering it, right? It's still that it's just that the like this historical conditions are created that allow the working class to take away the holdings of the capitalist class, right? That's what Marx is saying. But I mean, like, there's still a process by which, at the end of this, right, the workers are still, like, I mean, it's actually really weird, like, especially for somebody who wants to, be a tanky or mecha tanky or whatever, right? It's like it's like you want to, it's like, come on, man, like you want to valorize.
Right, real tankies want to shoot all those people.
Exactly, right? It's like, yeah, come on, like, are you a tanky or not? I mean, it's like, I thought you would have. It's like these are, you're supporting these revolutionary regimes that were, built, with blood and struggle. They have a, like, and now, like, where's all the squeamishness suddenly coming from? I mean, it's like, now you're not even willing to take away people's property.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that Nick Land gets wrong, and maybe is taking us up to some degree, is that each, I mentioned this before, but each kind of advance of the working class doesn't, I think, inhibit kind of the progress of capitalism, because each move in this way furthers, deepens the profitability crisis, forces capital to become increasingly concentrated, because only more and more concentrated capital in combination with the state can survive these increasingly large demands. And in face of a stronger working class, capital has to kind of become stronger and more organized and more centralized to fight back against the working class. And this all leads up to the point where we have something like Amazon, which we could, kick in the door of Amazon, take the prices off, and, we're 25% of the way to socialism.
Yeah, no, exactly, right. And it's like and this is kind of it's kind of Marx's point at the end of chapter 32 that like you have that it's like, look, if you're expropriated little mom and pop bookstores, right, that's going to be like unpopular and involve a lot of like really bitter struggle. But like you can just kind of like if all you're doing is like
I think this is
parody, not advocated. Just for any policemen, watching this, but it's like if all you're doing is like dragging Jeff Bezos out to the town square and shooting him, right? It's like that. Then it's like everybody claps and you go home and call it a day.
Yeah, and it's way too late in the video for us to talk about the PMC.
It is too late in the video for that. It's an interesting conversation.
I think what Kush said is very interesting. It's something I've been thinking about lately. If you read Nick Land in the 90s, like Meltdown and stuff like this, he has very well predicted the world as it was going to come to be in the 2020s. And, it wasn't just that he's predicting it, he wanted these things to come to pass. And very, very few writers in the 1990s wrote things which they wanted to happen, which then did.
Yeah, that's true. That is probably, that says something pretty funny, but also kind of sad that you have to have that accelerationist thing to like have that combination.
But the sad thing is, Nick Land's future has come true, and he hates it. all that he does on Twitter is complain about the world that he envisioned coming to pass, which is just no one can be happy in this world.
Fair enough.
Ben, how would you reply to this?
Sure.
This is one of the comments on the video of you and Has.
Ooh, I think that Lolno, I no longer have a PhD to give you, but you could have one of the master's degrees.
Because this is a real innovation. Because I've called you Ben Burger, but I'd never considered Venus Burger, and that's a step forward in Ben name production.
No, that's true. That's I don't think we can go back from that. Once it's happened, it's happened.
I was laughing too hard to click the right comment. Oh God! Well, that was fun.
Yeah,
we didn't define socialism.
Do you want to do that at the last minute of the stream?
No, not really, but we should have. But we can do it.
Yeah. I mean,
you could do a whole essay on socialism.
Defining socialism. Actually, that's not a bad idea.
Because I'm just super orthodox, and I literally just take the definition that Lenin took from Marx and like more or less quotes directly. But the thing is, by that, unlike everyone else, I don't mean country which is good. Various countries which I don't think are socialist, but which are good.
There's also that's our friend Derek Farn's line about socialism or barbarism. Why not both?
Right. Yeah, I don't think there's ever been a socialist country, and that seems self-evident if you believe what Lenin says. But I think there's been various countries which are good, like Cuba and so on.
I think that there's an interesting question about trying to extract definitions in general from Marx, because he so rarely, he says things that you can take as definitions of various concepts, but he so rarely presents them as definitions. Right, they're just kind of like the thing he's saying about it. You kind of have to do some interpretive work to be like. Okay,
I think the interesting thing for us to talk about wouldn't necessarily be defining socialism, but in fact defining the other thing, which is defining kind of country which is good, or country which goes towards socialism or goes towards communism or whatever. Like
because you could do. I mean, look, a lot of people in sort of like what I've noticed over the years is that a lot of people in the sort of Jacobin sphere do actually separate out those two things, because they'll sort of like grant the thing that you wouldn't want to grant, which is that like the USSR, for example, was socialist, but they'll be like, yeah, but like not a good kind of socialism, right? Not the kind
Right,
we want.
I say the opposite, that the USSR
The USSR was great, but
good.
wasn't socialist.
Yeah. Was not great, but like, it's all right.
Yeah, it was all right. It was all right. That's very British. I like that. Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
what Lenin says is basically he takes Marx's concept of the lower stage of communism and he calls that socialism. And the lower stage of communism is where you haven't fully abolished commodity production. Well, no, sorry. You have abolished commodity production, but there's still some kind of limit. And commodity production, the regime of commodities, is when things are produced for the sake of being sold. And capitalism is the economic system where that reigns. Where you've abolished that, but there's still some limit on the flow of goods, like there's labor tokens or whatever.
Right, I see.
Or labor vouchers or whatever.
So it's just the first stage of communism, the critique of the government.
And then the highest stage of communism is when, that's communism, it's proper communism. There's no limit on the flow of goods.
Yeah, because I think part of the deal here is that, I mean, there's a sort of part of the defining socialism problem is really a defining capitalism problem, because it's like, what is the feature of what we have now that we're calling capitalism, such that if you overcame that feature, you would then be, and you overcame it in the right direction or whatever, right? You didn't regress back to feudalism, where then you would call it socialism. And I think that Marx, which is funny to say because Marx famously doesn't really like making predictions, but when he does, right, end up making some predictions anyway. I think Marx predicts that there are a bunch of things that will sort of go together, right? That there's very often when he talks about socialism, more often than not, actually, the main thing he does when he talks about it is he really emphasizes like ownership and control of the means of production, right? He'll say, like at the end of chapter 1 of Capital, right? The Society of Associated Producers, stuff like that. But then like there's clearly this expectation that the achievement of the Society of Associated Producers of workers control production will march hand in hand with the end of production of the end of commodity production.
I think the interesting thing to define would
be the end of the state, which some people also want to throw into the definition, right? Like a classless, stateless society. And then I think once you realize that those are all things that might actually be separable, right? Like you might actually achieve one of the not separable in every direction or whatever, but like you could theoretically.
I sometimes think, will we ever get to the highest stage of communism? But then I'm like, I don't really worry about it because the lowest stage of communism or socialism would be really great anyway. So like,
yeah, I mean, look, I'm an American. I think I think if I mean like I have I weep tears of joy when I contemplate a scenario where we achieve like basic reforms that like they got to in Western Europe.
When you get healthcare.
Yeah, exactly. It's like
as the dried up Wojak demands. But yeah, I think it'd be interesting to try and define like when a state is proletarian.
I think sort of try to do some conceptual analysis.
Obviously, Marx thinks that the dictatorship of the proletarian would be transitory, and in the sense you assume that means it wouldn't be around for many years. But I think definitely, for me at least, the dictatorship of the proletariat would take a while. Do you know that? You know the big quote about the French Revolution from a leading Chinese communist?
Oh yeah. It's too soon to say.
Yeah. That's what I'd say about the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like the dictatorship of the proletariat is also an interesting phrase because there's this concept of like a worker state, which is something I feel like I mostly see from people who are influenced by the Trotskyist tradition, which is
the deformed worker state.
Yeah, right, exactly, right. It's like worker state, whether deformed or undeformed, right? Which is like, which is this sort of often seems to be understood as a society where the means of production have been expropriated from capitalists, but like at the same time, we haven't achieved socialism, and what it would take to achieve socialism in these people's conception is often a little bit unclear. But like, I'm not at all clear that what those people are thinking of when they say worker state has very much to do with what Marx means on the handful of occasions where he references this concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat. I think if you look at some of what Marx, there's like on Marxist.org, you can find like during the faction fight with Bakunin, there's like you can find Marx's like annotation of like some essay by Bakunin where he like talks a little bit about this. And it's kind of funny actually, because like Bakunin says like, well, if we had the dictatorship of the proletariat, they'd end up being in like conflict with the peasant majority, and it would be awful. And
yeah, that might have happened.
yeah, exactly. It's like, well, if you think that the Soviet Union was a dictatorship of the proletariat, that's exactly what happened, right? Or
Right.
Maoist China, whatever. So, and Marx kind of said, no, don't be silly. We won't. The victorious workers wouldn't do that because they'd understand they need to preserve this like long-term alliance, or whatever.
I mean, but also Marx fucking hated Russia and thought it would be the last place that ever became communist, because the Russian army was used in 1848 to crush revolutionary movements across Europe.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Believed in Russia as kind of the prison of nations and so on.
Yeah, and I think there are places where Marx and Engels kind of at least flirt with the idea that Russia wasn't even feudal, that it was like this other thing, this historical dead end of Asiatic despotism that would just have to like collapse or something so you could like restart and like get to eventually 20 steps later you get to capitalism.
Luckily they were wrong.
yeah. Right. Yep.
So next week we're not going to be doing that, probably.
No, next week we're not going to be doing that, although it's an interesting idea. I also received, since the last time we spoke, your list of demands for future essays, so I'll add this to the list. But
the other one we should do at some point, for one, just because we'll get lots of views, is antinatalism.
Antinatalism would be fun, yeah. Yeah, good to find some old True Detective memes and stuff, yeah. So, yeah. I mean, the downside is that I'd actually have to read some antinatalists, but I'm not sure I want to do that, but I'll think about it. Yeah. So yeah, next week we are going to do what I was originally planning for this week. So I had the original last week when we didn't do one of these. I wrote this essay about Hitchin the Philosopher, which is about Christopher Hitchin's debate with William Lane Craig. And what I wrote last Sunday was the sort of negative half of that. It was like, here's why I think, in fact, I actually think that in a certain way, that debate is sort of, I'm trying to think of a less reactionary way of putting this. I'm just going to go for it. Like is kind of an intelligence test for internet atheists that will often fail. Because they see like.
I mean, internet atheism is an amazing kind of culture in that they've invented all these moves to basically get themselves out of arguing, and that includes the move which Hitchin makes to his great defeat in this debate, which is to say there's no positive arguments for atheism.
Yeah, exactly, right. So it's like I have so it's like the first essay was like why I think that debate was such a disaster, why I don't think Hitchens' responses really work, and I think it's really bad. Right? He sort of writes himself this permission slip not to actually give an argument for his side of the argument. And then the second half, which I was originally going to do this week before I got distracted by MAGA communism, was about is essentially about like what he should have said, right? What the better version of what he did in that debate would be like. So that's going to come out next week. There's a reference to like the title of that is a reference to like something that like one of the innovations of internet atheism, which I absolutely hate, which is redefining atheism as the absence of
lack of theism.
Yeah, the lack of theism. And so the title of my
true atheism.
Yeah, exactly. The title of my essay next week is sort of a reference to why I hate that idea. It's called "My Dog Isn't an Atheist, But I Am." What Christopher Hitchens should have said to William Lane Craig. So that's coming out next week. Meanwhile, if for anybody who hasn't had quite enough MAGA communism today, in this afternoon, and you've read my Substack essay, benburgess.substack.com. You've just watched this, but it's like, no, I think I still want a little bit more MAGA communism talk. In about an hour and a half at 7 o'clock Eastern. So I do this call-in show every week, and on the call-in, I've got our friend Gene Bajalan is going to be joining me, and whatever else we talk about, we're going to talk about at least a little bit of MAGA communism stuff at the beginning.
Well,
So
you can tell Gene all the facts I've told you about.
Yes, I am looking forward to passing this on to him.
About infinite oil and genes and so on.
Oh, absolutely, goddamn-lutely. So if you want to tell me I'm full of shit about any of this, and do the exciting thing where you actually get to tell me with your voice, that's on call-in. So you can use either the app, or at this point you can just like listen and call in from your browser in about an hour and a half. And as soon as we're done here, I'll tweet out the link to that.
Cool. Goodbye, everyone. Wait, I'm going to play the outro clip. So
nice.
It'll take me a second. Found one.